Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Asia Pacific DNS Forum hosted by MyNick and ICANN. I'm Jerong, the Managing Director of ICANN's Asia Pacific office based here in Singapore. I'll be your moderator for today. Now, for some background, the inaugural Asia Pacific DNS Forum will be held in March next year. In a way, it's also a lead-up event as the international community is slated to gather in Kuala Lumpur for ICANN 75 in September next year. This is now the fourth webinar as part of our series of lead-up webinars, which is aimed to do a couple of things. The first is to level set and introduce the basics so everyone can join the conversation during the actual event. And the second is to see key topics which we can discuss more in depth during the actual forum. And today's webinar is on DNS Best Practices, and I'm grateful for everyone for taking the time to join us as we wind up for the year. Now, we have a very good lineup of speakers. So I'll introduce our speakers first. The first speaker is Graham Bunton. He's the director of the DNS Abuse Institute. Graham is well known in the ICANN community, having served as the chair of the registrar stakeholder group for 4 years. Graham was also one of the leads behind the framework to address abuse, a new set of guidelines and principles for addressing online harms, which was adopted by more than 50 registries and registrars. Now, our next speaker is Zhang Han. He's the Senior Software Engineering Manager of Salesforce. Han has a PhD in computer science. His research interests include network security and network measurement. If you're from the technical community, you would have seen Han at various fora like the DNS OARC, APNIC, and IETF. And I'm very grateful for our speakers for taking the time to join us. I would also like to apologize on behalf of our third speaker, Marika Kale, who is supposed to join us. You would have seen her name in our flyer, our various material. She's the Chief Information Security Officer for a company, and she has a sudden emergency on her hands as she's dealing with the Log4j Apache vulnerability. Some of you might have heard it. I think some of your own organizations, the IT teams are all scrambling to work on the patch. So if you've not heard about it, you can search for log4 shell or log4j, log with a numeric 4, then a shell or j. Marika conveys her regrets, and we hope that Marika can join us come the actual forum in March. And for fellow community members in your IT teams dealing with the log4j issue, all the best to all of us as we're working on the patch. Now, we had planned for Marika to share some of the work done by an interesting group she had led called the DNS Security Facilitation Initiative. Because she cannot join us and it's too late for us to get a replacement speaker, I'll cover a few points so as to help lay the ground for the conversation for today. I won't take the full amount of time that we had planned for our conversation with her. We can do that when we come to the actual event in March. And if we don't take the full 90 minutes of the webinar, we can end earlier as well. And I do apologize for any inconvenience here. So give me a second while I share my screen. All right, so I had mentioned that Marika led a technical study group called the as part of the DNS Security Facilitation Initiative. The members include well-known names from DNS protocol, global operations, incident response, cross-functional fields. And I'll take a few minutes to share some of the highlights. First of all, I'll point your attention to the blog, which I've done a screen capture here on this slide. The link is also on the slide, which you can download from the apecdnsforum.my website. We also place the links in the chat for you as well. So I'll point your attention to the blog, as well as the study group's final report, both of which were published in October. The study looked at global DNS issues. So it's not just issues related to DNS community only, but to the wider community, which includes security, internet response, ISPs communities. So it's really relevant for all of us. Amongst other things, the report highlighted that there are 7 categories of attack vectors, which are listed here on this slide. The most well-known one for most of us would be the last one, the denial of service attacks, which are DOS or DDoS attacks, which we know quite well. I'll share a couple of examples that can have an impact on all of us. So one of the categories is on identity and access management. So basically a registrant. So if you own a domain name, in the industry, we would term you as a registrant, or interchangeably, you would be known as a domain name owner. Your credentials are basically compromised under this attack vector. And the attacker can actually transfer your domain out of your control or modify the domains, your domain's DNS servers to allow intercepting of traffic or redirecting to a criminal destination. So people trying to visit your website might end up visiting another website. So this is an interesting area which we all should take note of, because we could all be affected by such an attack vector. Another example is on infrastructure choices. Basically, it's the choices an administrator made regarding like various configuration of DNS services, the choice of the software used. Sometimes, to keep costs down, they could build in less redundancy. But as a result, when you have less redundancy, when one site goes down, then another site might not be able to manage the load. So this is also very interesting for us as we business owners. When you're leaving your online business to a service provider, sometimes it's important to understand what are some of these choices they made on your behalf as part of their operations. So it's interesting for us to also want to take note, considering that security is more and more a requirement for all of us. Now, another interesting highlight in the report is that it listed various existing efforts and activities. There's quite a lot of activities going on right now. And like I mentioned, given our increasing concerns about security, we as a community in the Asia-Pacific region, we should really consider whether we want to participate. And perhaps this is something we can discuss more in depth come the actual forum in March when we get together. So there's a list of various events, efforts, and platforms like the DNS OARC. I mentioned that our speaker, Han, is regularly participates in this. Other forums like the FIRST, Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, DNSTransparency.org, Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, the IETF, MOG, the Anti-Phishing Working Group, etc. So just put a spotlight there and do check out the report. Then we can find out more, and hopefully we will get some time to discuss more in depth when we come together in the actual event. Now I'll stop sharing my screen. All right, with that done, just helping to cover some of the key points in what we had planned to discuss with Marika. And I'm sorry we are not able to cover that in depth, but I assure you that our 2 other speakers are equally, if not more interesting, and I'm sure you'll be in for a treat. So let's welcome our first speaker for today, Graham Bunton. Again, Graham's the director of the DNS Abuse Institute. Welcome, Graham. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, so can you tell us a bit about the DNS Abuse Institute to start with?
I can, and I'll admit I actually cooked up a couple slides for this too. So maybe I'll share my screen if you don't mind.
Please, that would really help.
There we go. Everyone should be able to see that. And let me just go to present. Great. So the DNS Abuse Institute was created in February this year by PIR, who run the .org TLD. And they asked me to come on board at that time and help them get this initiative off the ground. And comes from a place where PIR was seeing both an increase in what we call DNS abuse, and then as well as a growing concern about DNS abuse from both inside and outside of the ICANN community. And at that time, the time of creation of the Institute, I was working for a registrar at the time, Two Cows, and I was running the registrar stakeholder group's DNS abuse working group. And we had a sort of meeting of the minds on this, that DNS abuse is a global problem, sort of a collective problem, and that trying to solve it individually really wasn't going to work, and that collective solutions were required, and someone needed to stand up and start building those collective solutions. And PIR has an interest in serving the internet. That's part of their public interest mission as a not-for-profit, and so it really made sense for them that they would be the ones to support this effort. And so here we are with an institute dedicated to resolving issues of DNS abuse.
So can you share a bit more about what are some of the Institute's activities?
Sure. So the Institute is founded on three central pillars: education, collaboration, and innovation. And I'll talk through those for a moment. Education is pretty straightforward. This is really about producing materials to help everybody understand what DNS abuse is and what to do about it. And by everyone, I mean this is going to be things like best practices for registries and registrars. And in fact, we published one last week, I think, for helping registrars distinguish between malicious registrations and compromised websites. But also for internet end users. And we have another best practice coming out on Tuesday, just in time for the holidays, aimed at end users for helping them keep their content management systems and websites secure and safe, because those drive a lot of abuse as well. So really what we're trying to do with that education pillar is just provide free, accessible resources to all the different components in the internet that could use them. So that's one piece. The next piece is collaboration, and that's really about bringing people together, forums like this, talking about what we're doing, beginning to share ideas and best practices, and ultimately to get to the place where we're also sharing things like intelligence about what types of abuses are happening and where, so that registries and registrars, where they find their systems and platforms are being exploited in some way, or they're seeing trends in malicious domain registrations, that they'll be able to share them with each other, and that we can combat these collective problems collectively. The last piece, this innovation, is the one that I sort of find the most fun, and this is really where we're building tools and technologies to try and mitigate DNS abuse. We're working on two key initiatives right now that we'll be launching in 2022. The first one we're calling, intelligence, which is really, it's going to be akin in some ways to the domain abuse activity reports that ICANN puts out, but sort of next level. And this is partly for our own purposes. The Institute needs to have a, best in the world understanding of DNS abuse. It's kind of hard to speak from authority if we don't really know what's happening. And the other is that we just really want to be able to shape the conversations the community is having. Right now, we talk in anecdotes about abuse, about where malware is being, malware domains are being registered. We don't know. And so we need to provide that knowledge to the community to really push these conversations along. So we're going to be building reports and publishing monthly, how much phishing and malware is there by TLD and by registrar. And that will also include who's mitigating abuse and who's doing that the fastest. And so there's some really next-gen things that we can do with that data that we're pretty excited about. I think current plan, don't hold me to the fire on this, but we're aiming for sort of end of Q2 for that. And then the next big key initiative that we've got coming out right now is launching hopefully in Q1 next year is something we're internally calling the centralized abuse reporting tool. And this is going to be a mechanism where, and actually, maybe I'll back up slightly, reporting abuse to registrars, if you've found it, is terrible. The experience is really bad. There's no standards for evidence. Every registrar has their own abuse reporting mechanism implemented differently. Sometimes it's an email address, sometimes it's a web form. And so if you're trying to do this at any sort of scale, it's very difficult and very frustrating. And you find that with law enforcement, intellectual property interests, end users who are just caring about phishing, cybersecurity. It's a very frustrating process for them. On the other side, for registrars primarily, registries less so because they deal generally with less abuse directly than registrars. They get terrible reports in. They're unactionable. Sometimes the domains don't belong to them. There's no evidence. They're duplicative. Sometimes they're actually, content issues where they're trying to get websites taken down for other reasons. They're bad. And so they're bad on both sides, and no one's happy about it. And so we're building a tool that will be a one-stop place where anyone could go and report abuse. It's going to standardize that process. It's going to take that abuse report. It's going to enrich it with more information that we can gather from various sources around the web. Could be like through block lists. It could be through things like virus total. So we'll make that report as complete and factual and evidenced as we can, and then we'll pass that over to the correct registrar who that domain actually belongs to. And we'll be able to get that into their ticketing system or into their email queue, however they like it. So we're really excited about that one. We'll be launching a sort of small beta for that, hopefully in January, February for registrars. And boy, stay tuned for news of that. It's going to be, I think, really powerful.
That's very
Sorry, that was a
exciting.
lot.
No, it's good, Graham. So it's very exciting and very relevant for registries and registrars in the region. We'll talk more about how people can stay in touch and get up to date with news. But from the APAC DNS forum, after each webinar, we'll have newsletters. So any other information you have, feel free to send them our way. We'll help to share with the community as well.
Great.
Cool. Now let's step back a little bit because we talked quite a fair amount on using the term DNS abuse. And then there's the term DNS security. Is there for our APAC community members, is there a difference between the two terms, or are they seen as interchangeable?
That is a good point. So I use these two terms, and I'm not sure that everyone thinks of it this way, but this is how I do it. I think of DNS security as sort of inward looking. Is your platform, is your business safe and secure? Have you implemented the tools and technologies to keep your company safe? Inwards. Outwards looking is what I would call DNS abuse, and that's where my institute is really focused. And that's about, is your platform being used for harming the internet as a whole? Are people registering malicious domains to do bad things via your services? And so DNS abuse has a number of, people sort of get caught up in definitional issues with it. I find that very frustrating. The contracted party house within ICANN has adopted a formal definition. I use it, but it has its weaknesses, but it's, for all intents and purposes, it's practical, it's constrained, we can work from it, and we can sort of argue about the definitional margins when we've done some more work on some of the core problems, I think. So those core bits of DNS abuse are going to be the distribution of malware, phishing, something called farming, which we can talk about in a minute maybe, and the operation of botnets. There's another category for spam, where spam is used in the service of those preceding four harms. That can be a little bit difficult to sort out. But the sort of metaphor I like to use for understanding some of this is to think of these things as pollution, as the sort of toxic byproduct sometimes from running domain registration businesses. And the sort of a message I want to convey around that is that we can't pretend that's not happening. We can't pretend that those are not our problem, that if we're polluting this stream, if we're polluting the internet, that's not our problem. And it is our problem. So we need to do something about these abuses where they're interacting with our own platforms.
That's very interesting, Graham. So we talk about the 5 areas. They might be well understood by those in ICANN and the technical community, but maybe for our wider APAC audience, can we dive a little bit deeper into each of them? Malware, phishing, farming, botnets, spam.
Sure, happily. Yep. So I will say at a very high level, the Institute is focused at the moment, because I think this is where we're going to be able to do the most good, on malware and phishing. So malware is malicious software, is where you get that word from. And really this is software that's being downloaded and run on someone's computer, generally without their intent or knowledge. It might be, it's a virus of a sort. It's used to do things like steal credentials. The really big problem right now is ransomware, which is a type of malware which encrypts everybody's files and then demands a ransom to unencrypt them. And where this intersects with the DNS is that they're often distributed by both deceptive domain names, so often through something that looks like what we would call a phish, and also through compromised websites where someone's WordPress got hacked and someone has put some malware on it and is using that to distribute these files that people are downloading and running onto their computer, and then they're getting into these problems. The malware could also be used to turn your computer into a bot for a botnet. There's lots of purposes. It's really sort of a catch-all term for software you don't want surreptitiously put on your computer. I'll just keep going because I've got a few of these. Phishing, hopefully we're all reasonably familiar with, but this is really about putting up a website that looks like another more common website. Often that's a brand or a bank or a payment provider. It can be done by, sending links to these things are often done via email, sometimes SMS or other messaging platforms. And really what they're trying to do is for the most part, is steal credentials. They're trying to get you to log in thinking this is your bank, or a service you might use regularly, and now they've got your credentials for your bank and they're going to go try and log in. Phishing sites again interact with the DNS via malicious registrations, and I sort of have an example at the bottom of this slide where you would see something like login-PayPal with an extra P in it, -service dot whatever TLD that might be. That's sort of what they would look like in a very stereotypical example, and in fact you would see that sort of thing pretty regularly. Sometimes also via compromised WordPress sites where you'll see a regular domain name that has a bunch of slashes and a long URL, and then maybe there's a phishing website parked there too. So that's what phishing is about, really a deceptive website trying to steal your credentials. Botnets are another one. This is where a computer has been infected with malware or it has been hacked in some fashion and taken over. Usually computers, also often Internet of Things devices, could be, security cameras is a really common one. And then these are controlled by a malicious actor who has, got now an army of computers, an army of bots at their disposal, and they're using them for bad things, for scanning the internet to find other vulnerable computers, for sending spam, for distributing malware, for denial of service attacks is another big one. They use these bots to send out lots of requests and block networks or take down computers. Where these intersect with the DNS often is the command and control for the botnets is typically done through another website. Usually people come at those via, or often they are created via what's called DGAs, domain generation algorithms, where the botnet either registers or will register a whole bunch of basically random pseudo-random strings to control their botnet. And that's how they make it so that they can control them and lose one command and control computer, one domain, but still have control over their botnet. They're bad. They're very destructive. The last one, and it's a very thin slide. This farming shows up in the definition of DNS abuse, and I'm not convinced it really belongs in there. Farming is a combination of a DNS hijack. So on your local computer, someone is now poisoning your DNS and redirecting you somewhere else, and a phishing website is what farming is. And so there's very little, the overlap there with the bit of the DNS that we can do something about is basically already a phish, and so we've sort of captured that already with phishing. The sort of DNS hijacking piece is not something that a registry or registrar has any ability to impact, and so that's a problem. We include that in the definition, but it's not one that I see very commonly or have people strongly concerned about, but it's included in our list. And then spam, of course, I think we should probably all be aware of spam. You know, for the definition that we're using, it's really only where it's used in things like, phishing or the distribution of malware. And spam itself is hard to resolve at the DNS level. Most spam is using free services like Gmail and Hotmail and things like that. And you certainly wouldn't take down gmail.com for spam. And so we get into complications like that. But spam is the sort of last one of those harms I'll mention. Is that better?
Cool.
Is that the right layer of detail for you?
Yeah, it's very, very helpful, Graham. I think because when it comes to those who are not so initiated in this space, they cannot really see the correlation between these items and the DNS. But how you talked about, how they have a linkage to the DNS is very helpful. So there's quite a fair amount of work looked into this. So from your perspective, what are existing industry best practices when it comes to combating DNS abuse?
Right. So maybe I'll start because I have lots of thoughts about best practices and work that needs to be done. But maybe I'll start with some of the impediments to getting there. And especially for this audience, I'll say that language is a huge impediment. I'm running this institute. Everything I'm doing is in English, and I'm well aware that we need to be better at internationalizing what we're working on and translating what we're working on. But all of the tools that I've looked at and all of the algorithms I've been looking at for understanding and measuring and detecting DNS abuse, they're all very Anglo-centric. They're really all in English. And that's kind of not good enough. And so we really need to work on that. The other sort of strong difficulty in the space is domain names are an extremely competitive industry. It's the same product, regardless of the registrar around the world. And so everybody's competing really on price and the other services that they might be offering with it. And if someone doesn't like your price, they can go literally to any other registrar in the world. And boy, is that like a difficult hurdle when we're trying to get people to, build friction into their registration processes to try and capture abusive registrations. That becomes a real sticking point. So for best practices, not a lot exists right now for some of those reasons. I was talked about one that I put out last week on identifying malicious registrations. Hopefully that will be helpful, and I'll make sure I get that to you, Jianrong, so that you can help circulate it, please and thank you. And we'll look at getting that translated too. There's a few documents that the registrar stakeholder group has put out that might be helpful for people, and you can find those at rrsg.org. and I think look at they'll have a documents or something like that section around how to report abuse. But in terms of specifying like what a registry or registrar should be doing or could be doing, there's not a lot of out there, and that's one of the reasons that I'm, running this institute. I would say, everybody needs to start with understanding if they're operating a registry or registrar, their contractual obligations. Take a good look at what's in your contract. I will say that those contracts are ambiguous, but I think the writing is on the wall that we need to be doing more about DNS abuse. And so I think, going back to my pollution metaphor earlier, that we all have some ethical obligations, that if we're going to participate in creating new stuff on the internet, of making money from domain names, then we have an ethical obligation to ensure that we're doing our part to keep the internet safe. And as a part of that, boy, voluntary is better than mandatory. And so coming together, working on these best practices collectively, engaging hopefully with myself and the Institute, with ICANN, on coming up with creative solutions to reduce these harms, doing that ourselves is almost always going to be better than governments coming in and trying to tell us how to do that, or having ICANN compliance knocking on your door every day. So, I guess the message here is that we, that last point of collaboration, which is there's lots of work to be done. There's lots of low-hanging fruit in this space. I'm here dedicated to making this better for all of us. Boy, I hope everybody will come join me and listen to what we're putting out, participate in building new best practices, and hopefully making this better for everybody.
Yeah, Graham, you raised some very good points. Like the difficulties and a lot of the issues we're looking at right now. The tools are in English, whereas within the community here in this region, English is not the main language for most of us. I think that really gives us some food for thought, and also some potential problem statements for when we get together in March. I think we'll definitely try to invite you back and think of how to scope a discussion around some of these issues that we've raised. So before we get to March, what can our regions, like community registries and registrars, do? How can they work with you in the meantime?
Do I have more? Well, okay. So I have some contact information here. You can find me on Twitter. You can send me an email. The biggest piece is going to be in the launching of that centralized abuse reporting tool that will hopefully happen sometime in the first quarter of next year. We'll be looking for registrars to participate. Oh, it would be so good for me to have a registrar not from Europe or North America participate, because it would really be helpful to get an understanding of especially the language complexities that we're going to need to think about how to resolve. And so getting people in there and participating in that. The DNS Abuse Institute has a mailing list where we share our best practices and output. And so you can sign up for that on the DNS Abuse Institute website. Please do. And so I think those are the big ones. And if you just have questions, you need help with DNS abuse, boy, please reach out. I'm here to serve the DNS community and make all of this better, hopefully.
Thank you, Graham. All right, we've covered a fair amount with Graham, and let's pause here for any questions from the audience. If this is the first time you're joining us, you can ask questions in various ways. You can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask a question or give a comment, or you can type your question in the Q&A pod. And those of you joining us in YouTube as well, you can type your questions or comments in the comments. We'll take them too. We have one of our colleagues looking at the YouTube site, and she'll help with bringing the comments or questions into the Zoom room. So any questions, any takers at this point? While we're waiting, we do have one coming from Lakshmi Prasad Yadav, asking Graham if you can share the link of resources about the various initiatives you mentioned. So either you can share them now, or later on you can share them, or we can share them through a newsletter as well. We have various channels.
I'll paste some links. Thanks. I'll paste some links in the chat. And just a heads up that there's more coming out all the time. We hope to have a pretty good pipeline, regular feed of best practices and helpful educational materials.
Cool. Well, any questions? No questions at this point? All right. At any point, if something comes up and you thought about it, you can always type a question in the Q&A pod. Graham can come back and answer it. We'll have a final Q&A segment at the end of this webinar. So if something comes up in the meantime, please feel free. All right. Okay, let's then move on. Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you so much for taking the time. All right, let's move on to our next guest speaker. His name is Zhang Han. Zhang Han, or Han, is he's the Senior Software Engineering Manager of Salesforce. Big welcome to Han. And I think any Star Wars fan will not forget Han's name. So I'll just leave it as that. I think it's very easy for us to remember him. The other thing I'll introduce very quickly is also Salesforce. I don't think Salesforce needs much introduction, but when we think about customer relationship management systems, CRM systems, we'll think of Salesforce. So a big question for most people would be, why does a CRM or cloud-based software company like Salesforce, what has it got to do with the DNS? Now, Han, can you help us, help our viewers understand how Salesforce uses the DNS or provides DNS service?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Jiarong. I actually made a few slides, so let me share my screen. So there are multiple reasons why we want to deploy DNSSEC and why a large enterprise want to deploy DNSSEC.
Han, you had the earlier slide, I think.
Oops. Oh yeah.
So just tell us about how Salesforce uses the DNS or deploy DNS service in the first place, so people can understand what's the linkage between Salesforce and the DNS.
Sure. So at Salesforce, we provide various services and products, and the customers use these services by visiting the domains in different zones at Salesforce. And to give us sufficient authoritative footprint, instead of building our own infrastructure to serve our zones, we use third-party companies to serve our zones for the authoritative name services. And we also use multiple DNS providers for resiliency. In case when a single DNS provider is having an outage, the other DNS providers can still serve our zones. They can still answer the questions. And these third-party companies have global footprint. So when the customers query our zones and the records, they can get the answers from the closest data centers or from the name servers that have the best performance. And we use a number of zones at Salesforce, and some of them are very large, even before we decide the zones, before we deploy DNSSEC. And some of these zones are very dynamic. These zones have about 1 million changes per day, so that's about 700 changes per minute. And this is not unique to Salesforce. Some web hosting companies also have these dynamic zones. These frequently changes could introduce update propagation delays. And by update propagation delays, I mean when we make a DNS change, like creation, deletion, and update, how long it takes for these changes to be visible globally. And we want these update propagation delays to be as small as possible. So the users can always see the latest DNS queries globally.
I see. So let's talk about the best practice that our industry, specifically ICANN, including IETF and other sister organizations have been trying to push, that is DNSSEC, DNS security extensions. So most of you, our listeners or viewers would know what I'm talking about, but for the those who don't, I will do a short introduction. So basically the DNS was designed in the 1980s, and the primary focus at the time was just being able to communicate. So being able to send my information or data to you and you can receive it. So security was not a primary consideration in its design. Now, if you missed our very first lead up webinar, we still have the recordings on YouTube. You can go back and view it. But if you missed our very first webinar, we did talk about how the DNS works and the DNS resolution process. So Han kind of mentioned it, you know, you have to be able to answer queries, to find a website, and to find the location of a website. Basically, if I'm a user at home, my ISP's recursive resolver would send a query to a name server to find the IP address. But actually, there's no way the ISP's recursive resolver can actually verify the authenticity of the response from the name server. In other words, a hacker could actually spoof a response and then redirect you to a malicious website. So you're thinking you're visiting the same website, but actually you're not. So DNSSEC was developed as a solution by the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, and we've been trying to get people to adopt it for quite a number of years now. And the above said, the adoption rate is really mixed at best. And one of the key challenges is that everyone needs to adopt it, top level down to second level. And many ISPs, enterprises, they don't consider adopting DNSSEC despite the benefits. So here comes the question. Despite, like, you know, I've spoken to many people in the region and talked about DNSSEC, and, you know, the response I get is a polite, thank you, we tried, but we don't think it really works for us. But here comes the question for Han, like, why did DNSSEC appeal to Salesforce?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I have the same feeling. I heard mixed reactions when I talk to different people about DNSSEC. And so there are multiple reasons why an enterprise and why Salesforce wanted to deploy DNSSEC. So DNSSEC is a requirement of US FedRAMP compliance. So basically, FedRAMP is a federal program that ensures the proper level of information security is in place when US government agencies access the cloud services and the cloud products. And I believe there are similar regulations about DNSSEC in the other countries. And also, as you mentioned, ICANN also advised the DNSSEC, so all should use DNSSEC. And another big reason is DNSSEC provides a secure DNS service. It prevents different types of attacks like cache poisoning, spoofing, misredirection, and so forth. So having DNSSEC helps increase the trust for the users, so they can verify their DNS responses. So at Salesforce, we decided to deploy DNSSEC.
So since deploying, have you been able to see any specific benefits?
Yeah. So with DNSSEC deployment, we provide a secure DNS service to our users. So these users can verify the DNS responses. They can see whether the responses are authenticated. So when they acquire a domain, and by having DNSSEC deployment, it also closed the door to potential DNS attacks, like different types of attacks we just mentioned. And an indirect benefit we got from DNSSEC deployment is the improved update propagation delay, as I mentioned earlier. The reason was when we deployed DNSSEC, we migrated some of our zones from some DNS providers and platforms to the other DNS providers that better satisfy our DNS requirements. And by doing this, we improved the update propagation delay a lot. So that means our changes can be visible to the users much faster globally, which
That's
is nice.
Very interesting, because we sometimes think of deploying a technology or a solution. We tend to think of whether there is demand from customers per se. But on the other hand, when you deploy, the benefits are actually, a lot of it is also based on resourcing, like the cost. In this case, you don't have to think about deploying resources if you get another DNS attack. So if you get an attack, you might have to deploy resources to go and manage the attack. So that would be one interesting area. The other one, I think you made this point about the indirect update of the propagation delay is actually an improvement of your overall ecosystem, because you're working with other providers who also satisfy the DNS requirement. So you actually are tightening and strengthening your ecosystem with other providers who have all deployed a certain level of security. So that's really very insightful. So one other question is then did you experience getting more customers after deploying DNSSEC?
That's a good question. So I would say for the customers who do need DNSSEC, with our deployment of DNSSEC, we satisfy their requirements. And for the customers, for the other customers, we also provide a secure DNS service to them so they can verify their DNS responses, which is also nice.
That's cool. I think my takeaway is that if you want some big contracts and the clients have DNSSEC as requirements, you're already ready. Whereas if you're thinking only of getting the big customers, but you haven't deployed DNSSEC yet, then you might be behind the curve. Okay,
that
cool.
could be possible.
Yeah. So one other question, Han, from an operations or a technical perspective, was it difficult to deploy DNSSEC? And what kind of resources or help did you need?
So in our deployment, one critical thing we observed was we wanted to make this deployment as transparent as possible to the users. And by transparent, I mean we do not want to have maintenance window with downtime. So the services should not be interrupted when we deploy DNSSEC, and all services should be available all the time, and the customers can access their services and products there. And also, we don't want the users to make changes on their side. So we want to make this DNSSEC deployment as transparent as possible. And to be honest, the DNSSEC deployment was not easy, and it does require additional resources. For example, the engineer cycles to do the planning, to do the testing, and make the real changes to deploy DNSSEC, and also build some tools to monitor the DNSSEC status and so forth. So there are some engineering work to be done there. And also it requires some resources from the DNS providers. One example is, so when we sign a zone, the sizes of the zones are getting bigger because some additional types of records will be in the side zones like R6 and NSEC3. So those ones make the zones bigger. And we also migrated some of our zones from some DNS providers to the others. So all of these are additional resources. And when we deployed DNSSEC, we did have some challenges. So as I mentioned earlier, some of our zones are very large and they are very dynamic. So we had a challenge to find the proper DNS providers that can serve these very large and dynamic zones. And at the same time, we want the update propagation delay to be as small as possible. So we did have this challenge. And for resiliency, we also want multiple DNS providers to serve our zones. Yeah, so this also brings another challenge, which is to apply a proper DNSSEC models on multiple providers for the same zone. So that was challenging, and we also had some other challenges, and I don't think I will cover all of them. But another big one was the zone migration. So all of the zones are live zones being used in production. So migrating these zones is like changing the wheels of a car when the car is running at 100 miles per hour, and we cannot stop the car. Right? Yep. And I'd love to talk about more challenges in the future or offline.
Well, we'll definitely invite you back for a deeper dive. But I'm so impressed, because there's a lot of resources that and challenges you have to have, but you went ahead with the deployment anyway. And my takeaway is it clearly shows that Salesforce sees the benefits of DNSSEC outweighing the costs and the risks.
Yeah, so we actually calculated the risks by doing a lot of testings, like pre-delegation testing, deployment on testing zones, and also a lot of plannings. So we calculated this risk because any change comes with risks. But because DNSSEC provides a more secure DNS service to the users, we decided to deploy DNSSEC at Salesforce, although it requires some resources and there are some challenges there.
Well, one more question, Han. Like, what advice can you give to our audience if they're thinking about deploying DNSSEC?
Sure. Yeah, so I just talked about a lot of challenges and additional resources, but I don't want to scare any organizations that wants to deploy DNSSEC. So I think one thing I'd like to mention is not all organizations that want to deploy DNSSEC need to go through these challenges. For example, if your zones are small and maybe the zones are static, kind of static, then the deployment of the DNSSEC could be either than us. And if you don't have to migrate the zones between the DNS providers, then the migrations will be much easier than us for sure. And so based on our experience, I think the planning is really important. So we want to have a very detailed deployment, like at this specific time, we make this change, and then we wait for some period of time, and then at some other time, specific time, we make another change. So this is really helpful, especially when we have multiple zones to deploy DNSSEC, and sometimes maybe one zone is a child zone for the other zone. And we always want to have a rollback plan, a step-by-step rollback plan, because we cannot predict when the bad things happen. It could be possible something is broken at 1 a.m. During the midnight, and we are paged and we don't have enough time to get a cup of coffee. We have to jump on the bridge immediately to fix the problem. And in this case, having a very specific step-by-step rollback plan will be super helpful. Another thing worth doing is to have a lot of testing, including function tests, to make sure the software and the DNS providers are satisfying your DNSSEC requirements, and also they are doing DNSSEC correctly. And some other testing could be performance tests to measure the update propagation delays if it matters to you. And another thing I would recommend is to do some rehearsal, some practice for the entire process of DNSSEC deployment, including the rollback on the testing zone. In that case, we can get familiar with this entire process. Maybe we will find some surprises and some challenges when we do this. So it's much better than we have surprises when we do this on production zones. And the last one I would say is, so when we finish the deployment of DNSSEC, the job is not done. So before we have a party to celebrate, we also want to have some tools to monitor the DNSSEC status. And if something is broken, then we can be alerted and paged. Then we go online and fix them.
Thanks, Han. So some very good advice here. Definitely we'll need to find time to dive more into the details. When we were chatting, so for our viewers, when we were chatting before this webinar, Han made a very interesting point, like, about the practice on the testing zone, including the rollback plan. Because he said something like, if something goes wrong at 2 a.m. in the morning, you wouldn't want to be thinking about what to do at the time. But if you already had like a rollback plan with step-by-steps, if you wake up at 2 a.m., whoever is on duty just goes and looks at the rollback plan, which step are you supposed to follow? So it's very interesting to note that the planning is really quite important. So I find that very insightful.
Cool.
Yeah. Now, if you'd like to deploy DNSSEC and you don't know where to start, at ICANN we provide training, especially for our regional community. We've been doing that since we've started the office for a long time now. So feel free to reach out to us. You can write to us at apac@icann.org. My colleague will type in the chat for our email contact. And also you can keep in touch with Han and his team. You will see them frequently at key events like DNS OARC, APNIC, the IETF in the region. So you've recognized him, and you definitely, if you know Star Wars, you can't forget his name. So if you see him, feel free to reach out to him and we'll all stay in touch. Now let's pause here very quickly for any other questions we might have for Han. I saw somebody raise a hand. I saw Ruby raise her hand, but I think she dropped off. But you can raise your hand or type a question in the Q&A pod. And again, for those joining us on YouTube, type in the comments and we'll take the questions as well. Any questions? Maybe it's December, everyone's thinking of starting the holidays and not in the questioning mode. Okay, if we're not getting any questions, it's okay. I have some questions prepared for Graham and Han. Let's come back together. We'll talk about some broader issues. Maybe we're being too specific at this point. So Graham, Han, let's come back together and talk about some broader questions. So, in terms of today's topic, we're talking about the broader theme of security and best practices. And from where you are there any trends that you observe that might be worth noting for our audience? And would you have any advice for them? Maybe Graham, you can go first.
Sure. Thanks. So I think the trends I spoke to a little bit about earlier, especially around abuse, and I'm so focused on abuse that I apologize. That's really what I'm looking at. The sort of growing recognition that it's a problem, and I think for a long time the industry was sort of content to ignore it. But I'm seeing more and more people go like, okay, this is a real thing we need to deal with. Let's begin to get engaged. And so that movement from sort of laissez-faire to being more engaged, I think is really positive. With that comes what I'm seeing is just a little bit more sophistication in people's understanding of what DNS abuse is and what to do about it. And moving from like, and so that's to me a very positive progression from nothing to like it's a thing and like, okay, now let's begin to separate it. The best example I have of that, I think, is this sort of beginning of people to figure out that some domains are maliciously registered and some websites are compromised. Both can be used for doing bad things, but what we should do about those things, those two different scenarios is different, and it's important that we understand that difference. And that's the sort of thing I'm thinking about and seeing more of, and I think that's really good.
Cool. And Han, what about you from your perspective?
Thanks. So we talk about DNSSEC, and DNSSEC solves a lot of problems. It prevents cache poisoning, phishing, and some other attacks. But it doesn't solve all the problems because DNSSEC itself doesn't encrypt the DNS queries and the responses. So that means the attackers could sit in the middle and somehow they can collect your DNS queries and the responses. Then they can do a lot of malicious things. Maybe they can profile a specific user. And so to solve this problem, the DNS queries and responses can be encrypted. And this is a DNS privacy issue. And now we have some RFCs and protocols to solve this problem, such as DNS over TLS, DNS over HTTPS. So by doing this, the DNS queries and responses will be encrypted. And I think with a combination of DNSSEC and this DNS privacy, it solves a lot of problems. And so this DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS encrypt the regular DNS queries and responses. At the same time, some other DNS traffic also needs to be encrypted, like zone transfer, including AXFR, IXFR, because the attackers could potentially build out records of your zone if they collect enough information by watching this zone transfer. And by using zone transfer over TLS, it can solve this problem. So I think this one is worth doing.
Thank you. All right, we seem to be getting a first question from Jessie. She asked, does DNSSEC guarantee no DNS abuse? I think it's kind of like, maybe Han, you want to talk about this first?
Sure. It's a good question. So Yes, as we just talked about, DNSSEC solves some problems, and there could, but I don't think it solves all the problems. For example, if NSEC is used in DNSSEC, the attackers could potentially do a lot of these queries, and they can walk the zone, enumerate all the records in the zone by looking at these NSEC records.
Graham, let's go to
if
you.
you do NSEC3, it will solve the problem.
Yeah.
So my answer to that is that unfortunately I don't think it does. You know, increasing the prevalence of DNSSEC is good because it's sort of a pain in the butt for people to go through. Unfortunately, it's I think that's part of what Han was talking about, and so it becomes a good signal at some point if it became prevalent enough that if a domain didn't have it enabled, then it's maybe potentially more likely abusive, but people can still register a domain name for malicious activity and sign it and have DNSSEC on it and still use it for bad things. Or you can still have it signed and run an out-of-date WordPress, and that gets hacked, and now you're distributing malware. And so it doesn't solve some of those problems.
Yeah, Graham, I think earlier in your when we were chatting earlier in your segment, you did talk about DNS abuse has various categories and it's very broad. So it's not exactly DNSSEC is like a one portion of the whole issue, right?
Yeah, it's a sort of large and complicated issue. We get into that sort of definitional stuff that people were talking about. There's lots of pieces to the puzzle for reducing DNS abuse. Some of that can be some of that internal stuff like DNS security you were talking about at the very top of this discussion. Enabling DNSSEC and getting that out across the board. Other things that increase email deliverability, like DMARC and DKIM, and what's the other one I'm forgetting that's very common. All of those things are pieces of a puzzle, and really, the more we can do to make using the DNS and domain names less attractive for malicious actors, the better. Just all of these little impediments are going to be what ultimately drive the cost of DNS abuse up for bad actors, which is, they're very creative. We're not going to stop people from being bad. I think they'll find ultimately other avenues, hopefully outside of the DNS, hopefully to darker, weirder corners of the internet, which will impact less people.
Thank you. I think, Graham, your earlier analogy of DNS abuse being like pollution is easy to understand. Like, just like how you described, every additional impediment we make for attackers to makes the environment a better place. So it's kind of like, each of us, if we just cut back on the use of straws, it makes it better. I find that kind of correlates with me directly.
Good.
Cool. All right, so no other questions at this point, but I do have one other last question, and if we don't have, we can always end early. So we asked this of all our guest speakers: what is something you'd like the APEC DNS forum to discuss more of come March, or is it something that you hope the forum could achieve? Let's have Han go first this time.
Sure, thanks. Yes, one thing maybe we could have is a DNSSEC specific workshop, so we can sit together and share our experiences, challenges, and some fancy ideas together. Besides, the enterprises share their experiences of deploying DNSSEC, so maybe we can have some DNS providers they can share their insights and the experiences and the interesting stuff about DNSSEC. So that would be interesting too.
Thank you. Let's work towards having a session there, because definitely for today's more introductory session, we couldn't cover quite a lot of detail. And Graham, what about you?
Oh, I mean, I have endless amounts of things I'd love to talk with people about. So it's in April, is that right?
Yeah, 30th March to 1st April.
Great. So I think we're aiming to launch one of our tools, this centralized abuse reporting system, basically on that date. And so a demo of that would be really cool to show people and begin to get other, registrars onboarded and show people how they can report abuse. And then I think there's some really interesting discussions to have with the community around beginning to prevent abuse before it happens. So rather than waiting for reports of abuse, to be able to detect malicious registrations at the time of registration. And there's some, figuring out where incentives align with industry and abuse is going to be some really interesting, thorny, difficult conversations. And I would love to begin having those. The APAC forum might be the place for that.
Great. Let's work towards that as well. So any other last questions or comments from the audience? Otherwise, we are strangely quiet this round because the last 3 webinars, we had quite a fair amount of questions. But if we're not having any, then we'll wrap up the webinar for today. But before we go, please join me again to thank Graham, Han for taking their time to join us outside of their time zone because they're not based here in Asia. But a big thank you for taking the time. Sorry, I got Save who raised his hand. I'm guessing it's a wrong click. Yep, it's a wrong click. Yeah, but please join me to thank the speakers. And before we go, I'd like to invite everyone to stay after the webinar to take our survey. We'll post a link in the chat box for you to fill up the survey to help us get better. So with your feedback, we can adjust accordingly. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can also take our survey by visiting APAC DNSforum.my and be sure to register and receive news for our next webinar coming in January. And our next webinar topic will be digital initiatives in the Asia Pacific. We'll see you then. And here's wishing you an advance happy holiday and happy new year. Catch you guys again next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.